a lot for joining us. The recording is now in progress. Thanks a lot for joining us for this session. We have 4 presentations today. There will be 20 minutes for each presentation. And I emailed the presenters before. We all agreed that we would accept questions to the extent that they are reasonably short during our presentations. And then there will be a 10-minute discussion at the end of the session for additional questions. So we can start now with Caroline presenting her paper with Julia Cagé and Elisa Mougin on money and ideology evidence from candidate manifestos. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Vincent. So you already introduced the paper, so we'll jump right ahead in the introduction. So the role of money in politics has been widely investigated, in particular, the impact that campaign spending may have on electoral success or the returns that donors may expect on their political donations. But we know very little about the influence of money on political discourse and ideology. Even though before influencing electoral outcomes and the behavior of elected politicians, we may expect campaign contributions to affect the things that politicians talk about during their campaign, the ideas that they push forward, and the information that is made available to voters before the election. And these effects may depend on where the money comes from and the identity of the donors, and also it may depend on the political parties and the types of politicians. So in this paper, we study the impact of corporate donations on the content of campaign communication. And to do so, we construct a novel data set that contains 2 pages manifestos issued by all individual candidates to the French Parliament, which we analyze through text as data methods, and which we combine with detailed data on these candidates' campaign contributions. Next, we exploit a national ban on corporate donations, which was passed in France in 1995. And we adopt a diff-in-diff approach by focusing on the 2 elections around the ban, so the election before and the election after that national ban. And that way we can estimate the causal impact of corporate donations, and we can test for heterogeneous effects across different parties and different types of donors. So as a preview of the results, we find that corporate donations do influence electoral discourse. They encourage candidates to advertise their local presence in their manifesto and to shift the policy topics that they focus on by talking more about economic issues. We find that these effects are stronger for niche parties and independent candidates, so for non-mainstream candidates, which are candidates for whom we also see a moderation effect on the left-right space of language. So we discussed several mechanisms, and these effects could come from a quid pro quo effect and the fact that politicians have to pay back their donors after the election. So they kind of change their political agenda to better serve their donors' interests, and this is reflected in their campaign communication. But in this context, we believe this is not the most relevant mechanism. So we propose a more novel mechanism, which we call an electoral effect. The idea here being that receiving corporate donations somehow affects the politicians' perceptions of what their voters care about and which issues are most important to them. So they adjust their electoral discourse accordingly. So these results contribute to a very large literature on campaign finance and political connections. But while the existing literature has focused on the effect of campaign finance on electoral outcomes or legislative behavior or public procurement contracts, in this paper, we take a step back and we look at what happens even before the election takes place and how campaign contributions may shape political discourse at the campaign stage. And because of that, we also contribute to more recent literature on campaign messages, which have been found to matter in voters' decisions. And so in these papers, we show that the donations and the donors may influence the content of these campaign messages. So for the rest of the talk, I will present to you the institutional setting and the data. I will present the empirical strategy, the main results. I will discuss the mechanisms, and I will conclude. So first, institutional setting. So we are looking at France, which went through a series of campaign finance reforms in the late 1980s and early 1990s. In particular, the reform that we are most interested in is this 1995 an unanticipated ban on donations from all legal entities, which we refer to as corporate donations in the rest of the talk. And this ban was passed between two legislative elections in 1993 and 1997. So these elections are quite similar to the congressional elections in the US, for instance, in the sense that we have, in each district, we have candidates who compete for one seat in the lower house of the French parliament. But unlike the US, it's a multi-partisan election, so there are many candidates competing for the same seat. On average, we have 10 candidates per district in our sample. And most of these candidates are endorsed by a national party, but about 30% of them run as independents. And something that is quite very important to us is the fact that these candidates issue their own campaign manifesto before the election, which is distinct from their party manifesto, and which is mailed by the state to all registered voters a few days before the election. So these manifestos really represent a systematic record of the candidates' communication with their voters, and they are quite a popular medium for voters to learn about their candidates. So in 2017, there was a survey that asked respondents how they learned about candidates in their district, and the manifestos were cited as often as online media. So it's not a completely negligible part of campaign communication. So here is an example of such manifesto. So it's a 2-page document, which usually contains a picture of the candidates and then a bunch of text in which the candidate can advertise the policy proposals of their party, for instance, or talk about themselves and their own qualities. Something to keep in mind about the content of these manifestos is that we are looking at parliamentary elections. So even though candidates are running at the local level in a district, they are running for a national mandate. And if they get elected, they will actually have quite little policy autonomy once in office, because they will be tied to the political group that they will belong to in the parliament. So they are not completely free to do anything they want in the manifesto. They are somewhat constrained to follow the party line. But there are still some aspects of language that we believe that they have control over and that could be affected by campaign contributions. The first one is that they could choose to campaign on national policies, so run a very national campaign, or instead to advertise their local presence. Because even though they are not personally responsible for local policy making, they could try to show voters that they are aware of the local issues of interest, or that they share the same experiences and the same preferences, so that they would be a good representative of their local interest once in office. They could also choose to run a more or less partisan and polarized campaign. They could focus on some policy topics more than others. And finally, they could decide to use a template that would be common to all the candidates in their party, or to issue a more personalized and more original message instead, which we are going to treat as a proxy for the overall quality of their campaign communication. So to test for the effect of contributions on these different possible outcomes, we collect more than 10,000 candidate manifestos that were issued in both 1993 and 1997. And we use computational text analysis to construct measures from text that reflect the 4 different dimensions that I mentioned before. So we have a measure of the prevalence of local references, like municipalities in the district, over the frequency of national references, like the number of times a candidate mentions a party leader or a member of the government, for instance. Then we also use a supervised scaling approach to measure the partisan leaning of discourse from left to right. And we use a supervised classification method to measure the prevalence of different policy topics, like economic issues versus social issues, for instance. And finally, we use an unsupervised approach to measure the overall originality of the manifesto relative to other manifestos from the same party. So next, so this was for manifesto. On the other side of the equation, we have campaign contributions. So there we use data on the aggregate spending and sources of revenue for all candidates, knowing that the 4 main sources of revenues are the contributions from their party, personal contributions, which are candidates self-financing their own campaign, and then donations from private individuals, so people like you and me, and corporate donations. And in 1993, which was the last year when corporate donations were legal, about a third of the 5,000 candidates running in the country did receive at least one corporate donation. And for this project, we collect much more detailed data on the corporate donations specifically. by digitizing paper data from the National Commission that records the spending and revenues of all candidates. So we have a bit more than 14,000 corporate donations for 1993. Their average amount was 2,000 euros in constant euros, knowing that they were capped at 10,000 euros. And we use a matching procedure to identify the unique donors out of all these 14,000 donations. And we find a bit more than 10,000 of them. So first takeaway is that in our sample, like a vast majority of the donors are what we call small donors, in the sense that they make one single donation to one candidate. And another takeaway that we found interesting is the fact that out of the multiple donors, so the ones that make donations to several candidates, about 70% of them give both to candidates from left and right. So there is a good amount of what we refer to as non-partisan donors in our sample as well.
Caroline, you have a question in the chat?
Okay. Sorry, do the corporate donations follow directly to candidates, or do they go to the party and are distributed across? No, good question. So no, they go directly to the candidates. And candidates can also receive contributions from their party. And where that money comes from, well, it could actually comes also from corporate donations before the ban. But what we refer to as corporate donations in the talk is really the money that candidates get directly. Okay. So let me keep going then. So now empirical strategy. So first, the first thing that I'm showing you here is some descriptive evidence of who receives corporate donations. So I'm plotting the coefficients from a regression of the amount of corporate donations received in 1993 on candidate characteristics and party fixed effects. And the first takeaway is that, well, of course, donations are not randomly allocated across candidates. So incumbents and mayors tend to receive much more donations than others. And candidates from the Socialist Party and the mainstream right-wing party also receive more donations. So we need an empirical strategy to handle this endogenous allocation of donations. And I think I will skip right through the next to the equation. So we adopt a diff-in-diff approach in which we regress one of the 4 textual outcomes I mentioned before on the amount of corporate donations, which is always 0 in 1997, but which can be positive in 1993. We control for candidate fixed effects. So we restrict the analysis to candidates who run both in 1993 and in 1997. We also control for party times year fixed effects and for time varying candidate control. So our identification assumption is that the trends in campaign communication among candidates of the same party are independent from the corporate donations received in 1993. So implementing this, estimating this equation, we first find that one standard deviation increase in corporate donations increases the local index by 16% of a standard deviation. And that this impact on the local prevalence is driven both by an increase in the frequency of local references and a decrease in the frequency of national references. So candidates run a more local campaign and less national one. We do not find any average effect on the left-right score, so the location on the left-right space, or the extremeness of discourse, so how far from the center the candidate is. But this is masking some heterogeneity across parties. We do find, for instance, so here in this table, I am estimating the same regression, but interacting the amount of donations, but by an indicator for each of the main parties in the sample. And there we find that there is a particularly strong effect on local prevalence for the Green candidates from the Green Party, for whom we also see a negative impact on extremeness, meaning that the donations tend to push Green candidates to moderate their discourse. And we also see the same pattern, although the coefficients are not significant, for the far-right candidate, with also a quite large but not significant negative effect on extremeness. Smaller extents, we also see that pattern for independent candidates. And the last piece of results
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Sure.
The effect on the left-right score for Green candidates, does it mean that they are pushed to the right or to the left by the donations?
Yes, it means that they are pushed to the right. So positive coefficient means that they are pushed to the right. And because they started from the left, that's why their extremeness decreases. They get closer to the center. For the far right, we see the reverse pattern. And the negative effect on the left-right score means that they are pushed to the left, which results also in a negative effect on extremeness because they are pushed to the center.
And do you have some hypotheses for why the green candidates and the far right candidates are driving those results?
So that's what I'm going to discuss in the mechanism part. So in a minute. So before I jump into the mechanism of results that I wanted to show you is the effect on the prevalence of these different policy topics. So there we see a positive impact on economic issues and an almost perfectly symmetrically opposite effect on social issues. We also see a positive effect on domestic issues like homeland security and administration, and a negative effect on foreign policy. And so now to try to tie all these results together and make sense of them, I'm going to discuss possible mechanisms. So I will jump right into them in the interest of time. So the first mechanism that we consider is a resource effect. So here we may think that corporate donations have an effect on electoral discourse because more donations means more money, so more resources to run a better campaign. Which may explain why candidates, when they increase the local prevalence because they may have more resources to do more research on local issues, for instance. But we do not think this is the main channel, mainly because we see some heterogeneous effects across donors. So we find that the effects are particularly strong for donations from small, single district and non-partisan donors, while the effect is not significant and even negative for the large donors who give only to left-wing candidates or only to right-wing candidates. So here the identity of the donor seems to matter, and the effect of receiving donations is not the same as receiving any money, which is not consistent with a pure resource channel. So the next mechanism we consider is a quid pro quo effect, which is maybe the most intuitive one. The idea that politicians have to pay back their donors and serve their special interest once they are elected, which would explain why donations from local donors also increases the prevalence of the local prevalence in candidates' discourse, because these donors may have very local economic interest. But again, this explanation doesn't seem consistent with the fact that we don't see similar effects on the local prevalence in discourse once elected. So we replicate this exercise by using textual content produced by the elected MPs, and there we do not find a similar effect on local prevalence on economic issues. So it doesn't seem that once they are elected, candidates still pay more attention to local issues or to economic issues. And also, it's not to get back to your question, Vincent, this effect would not be consistent with the fact that the impact is larger for the non-mainstream candidates who have virtually no chance of being elected, so no chance of really having influence that would serve their donors' interest after the election. So that's why we consider this last possible mechanism, which we call an electoral effect. Here, the idea is that engaging in fundraising activities and making connections with corporate donors somehow affects the candidates' beliefs regarding their voters' preferences and their issues of interest. And that may explain why we see these larger impacts on the non-mainstream candidates, because we may expect these candidates to have less precise priors regarding their voters' preferences. So when they receive some signal that they update their beliefs a lot, and they also adjust their rhetoric a lot. So this effect is also consistent with the fact that local corporate donors push candidates to advertise their local presence and to focus more on local economic issues like construction and amenities, which is a result that I haven't showed you, but which we find. I think I'm running out of time, so I will use the 1 minute that I have left to conclude. So in this presentation, I've showed you evidence that corporate donations influence the content of campaign communication. They encourage local advertising and push candidates to favor some policy topics over others. The identity of the donors matters, so money is not neutral. And we find larger effects on non-mainstream parties. So policy implication is that, well, the choice of campaign finance regulations does affect ideology and political discourse. And even in the absence of corruption and quid pro quo relationships, because these effects can go through politicians' beliefs. And so this impact on beliefs and campaign rhetoric may be part of the explanation for why money ultimately affects voters' electoral outcomes and representation. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Caroline, for the presentation. We will have some time at the end if there are some follow-up questions, but let's switch immediately to Martin, who is going to present a paper. Martin, perhaps you can share your screen. So Martin is going to present a paper on unions and robots, automation, and the political power of organized labor that is joint with Carlos Balcazar.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can see the slides.
Okay, this is great. Can you tell me when I'm 5 minutes?
I will.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so first, let me introduce myself. My name is Martín Castillo, and this is a joint work with Felipe Balcazar. We are both PhD students at the politics department at NYU, and our project is called Union and Roads, Automation and the Political Power of Organized Labor. Felipe is also here, so if you have questions, you can put them on the chat, and he's gonna be answering them. Okay. So the way we are motivating this is that we see that there's a lot of research on how automation has increased inequality, right? Either wealth or income. And most of these accounts talk about market forces, right? These are mechanisms that go through unemployment or wage gaps. And in this paper, what we aim to do is to actually complement this literature by exploring political consequences of automation. In the sense, particularly how does automation erode the political power of labor unions? The framework is that in most democracies, unions and corporate interests conflict in trying to shape or curve lawmaking or policy making, and this conflict often happens through lobbying, campaign contributions, and strikes. And so, the more particular question here is how does automation is affecting these outcomes? The argument that we want to push forward is that we want to say that automation actually weakens the bargaining power of labor unions. This actually reduces the wages and benefits of unionized workers, which actually reduces the unionization rates or the unionization density. And then the consequence of this is that weaker unions have less resources to put into either campaign contribution or lobbying. And then this is actually generating a systematic pattern of curbing policy making in detriment of unions' interest. The overview of what I'm going to present today is that we're going to develop a model that is actually formalizing this intuition. And then we want to try to provide, empirical evidence, by going to the data in the private sector between 2004 and 2014, focusing on congressional districts, and focusing ultimately on the policy responsiveness of congressmen and congresswomen and how they're voting on bills that are important for labor unions. The literature that we're talking to and we aim to contribute to is the literature on automation and technological change and inequality, and also the literature on labor unions and inequality. So you have these two parallel, somehow parallel accounts of explaining rising inequality in the recent decades, and we basically want to make a contribution like in the intersection of this. So this is the outline. I'm going to present the model, then empirics, some results on heterogeneity, and then the summary. So the way our formal theory kind of like tries to formalize this idea is that we're going to have a model of where we have an employer, a labor union, and a continuum of workers indexed in the closed interval between 0 and L. an employer is going to own an amount R of robots. Each worker is going to decide whether to join a union by paying a fee. And then if a mass of L of workers participate, then the employers is going to get a revenue that inputs both the amounts of robots and the mass of workers that are participating in production, right? So this is a standard production function with weaker conditions than in ADA. And in a way here, a key assumption here is that we are assuming that they are substitutes, right? So in a way, robots are substituting workers. Non-unionized workers are going to receive a market wage that is, exogenous. And then union and an employee and the employer are going to bargain the wage for the unionized workers. The sequence of play that we have in mind is that first, each worker is going to decide whether to join the union or not. Then the union is going to bargain the wage of the unionized workers a la Rubinstein's alternating offers, where as long as they don't reach an agreement, the less output is produced because unionized workers are not going to participate in production, but they're not going to get a wage, and non-unionized workers are going to always participate in production, and they're always going to get their wage. And then at the end, after they reach an agreement, then production takes place and revenues are collected and wages are paid. The payoffs of each of the players, are the following, right? This is the payoff for under no agreement, the per period payoff, under no agreement and under some agreement once they have already reached agreed to pay a unionized wage. And then this is important. The worker per period payoffs is going to be, if they're not unionized, they're always going to receive their wage, and if they're unionized, it depends on whether they have reached an agreement or not. And here in this, we have this idiosyncratic term that is accounting for all the non-economic benefits or harms of belonging to a union, right? This could be, people know that unions tend to be left-wing, for example, in the US, or they tend to be more democratic, or some people just don't like the idea of losing freedom to participate in the labor union. And we assume that the union is trying to maximize the economic benefits of its member. Okay, because it's an alternative offer, we're going to have discount factors. And the main result of the model, so first of all, there's a unique equilibrium, a pseudo-imperfect equilibrium, and the endogenous here outcomes are the mass of unionized workers and the wage of the unionized workers. Then when we go to the comparative statics, we show that as the intensity of robots increases, right, as when you have an exogenous increase of robots, then the number of unionized workers decreases, their wage decreases, and also the union density decreases, right? The number of unionized workers, per workers in the workspace. And the intuition behind the results is that as more robots are introduced in the workspace, the average productivity of workers, which is the key determinant, in a bargaining model of the unionized wages, decreases, which means that strikes are less harmful to the employer. So then the union actually loses bargaining power. And then we also have extensions to endogenize, to see under which conditions, when we endogenize the demand for labor, and try to make we make these results more robust. And so when we try to test our theory, this is the empirical strategy that we have. We're going to have, here we're going to have differences on union activity, contributions, or policy responsiveness here right from one year to the other, and then we're gonna the treatment here is going to be exposure to robots, right? How many the exposure to robots measured as a Bartik, as a Bartik instrument. And here we're trying to follow the benchmark of Acemoglu Restrepo, which is this Bartik measure is composed of a share, right? So what are the shares of workers that as a baseline, and then we're going to have it's also is composed of a shift that has to do with changing robot adoptions during that period. and then we're going to control for import shops, information technology, socio-demographic industry, and some pre-treatment, collective bargaining, and strikes. There are a lot of reasons why one might think that this is super endogenous, right? Especially because strong unions might not allow robots to enter in the first place. And so then we're going to try to instrument by exposure to robots in other more advanced robotized economies. And again, this is we're trying to follow what's out there. So this is going to be our empirical strategy, and we're going to report both the OLS and the instrumental variable estimates. So going to the main results, the effect of robot penetration on union membership, what we have is that there is a decrease in the number of unionized workers. In the percentage, there's a percentage change increase on the number of unionized workers, and a decrease on union density, right? So regardless if you count the whole mass of unionized workers or the per capita or the percentage of unionized workers, they both go down. We also find that there's a decrease in labor contributions, right? So measure from labor, associated, contributions or their PACs. And there's a decrease in the likelihood of also individual contributions. Then that's on campaign contributions, and then we also have results on how the change in the likelihood that the legislator in the given congressional district is voting in line with the union interests, and we document, right, like something like a little bit higher than a 3% decrease in the likelihood that their legislators are voting in favor of them, of the bills that they care about, as published by the American Federation of unions. So we also document can explore for other outcomes that are implicitly in our theory. I mean, explicitly accounted for in our theory. We find no statistically significant change on the number of workers that participate in collective bargaining as they're exposed to an increase of robots in their workplace. And we actually see an increase in the number of workers that strike, right? So in a way, this is telling a story different from our model, mostly because our model is still too simplified. Of course, the left-hand side plot, these results might be accounted because there's a non-random selection of the workers that lose their jobs, right? Probably unionized workers get to keep their jobs, while non-unionized workers don't. And then here, of course, whenever new robots are introduced, there might be informational, asymmetric information about the relative bargaining power that you can only solve that, by going to strikes. So that's on the basic main points that we want to make, that increase in robots actually weakens the bargaining power of labor unions, and that has consequences when they conflict as special interest groups. And then we also have some results, and we also have some theory regarding what are the heterogeneous effects of this of robot penetration in the workplace. So here what we're doing is that we're trying to measure, we're trying to categorize high skill and low skill workers by whether they have a college degree. And we try to document their differential reaction to, in terms of our outcomes. So here on the left-hand side, we have the percentage change of number of unionized workers as there's, as the share of skilled labor changes. So we see that it's in a way it's a weak result, but you can still try to interpret that high skilled workers tend to be tend to drop out of union activities much more than low skilled workers. On the right hand side here we have the change in the likelihood of individual contributions to campaigns, and again, right, so there's a statistically significant result on skilled workers contributing less to campaign contributions.
You have about 5 minutes left, Martin.
Okay, so I'm gonna finish early. I think this is one of the last results. What we have here is the effect of wait, what? Yeah, there's also a change in the wait, I think I'm confusing myself.
Yes. I can interrupt real quick. So that is the heterogeneous effect of an increase in one robot per 1,000 workers on the likelihood that legislators are voting in line with the preferences of the unions. And so it changes from the share of, it's moderated by the change in the share of high skilled labor pre-treatment. Yeah.
Thank you, Felipe. Yeah, I confused myself by not adding the label. That was my bad. And then, so basically the summary of what we have now is that we have this claim or this intuition that we want to try to test that that automation actually reduces the policy responsiveness to labor unions' interests, mainly because they weaken the bargaining power of labor unions, which decreases union membership and which decreases campaign contributions from labor groups. And we also try to make a point that the effect of automation is stronger in high-skilled / more educated workers. So that's what I wanted to present for today. This is a project that with Felipe we have been struggling to push forward as grad students and painfully learning the process of trying to make a paper under the good standards of positive social science research. So any advice or suggestions on any of the dimensions that you may think the paper needs to go or it's failing, we very much appreciate. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Martin, for this great presentation. We can, if there are immediate questions, we can spend a few minutes on them since you finished a bit early, and otherwise we can have a discussion at the end of the session. So if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask immediately.
I have a quick question. So there's this literature saying that labor saving technologies, they generate labor unrest. There's this paper by Hans-Joachim Voss and Bruno Capretini. And I'm wondering whether you have like some idea why the incentives at the firm level might be different than what's happening, like basically like robots are driving unionization rates down at the local level, but maybe that's this aggregate effect in which like maybe people are voting differently or they are rioting, they are doing something else. I don't know, trying to connect your paper with those papers connecting like the Industrial Revolution with labor riot in the 19th century, for instance. I don't know, I'm wondering the difference between your results and that, for instance.
So this is in the early 20th century?
19th century, so 1830s.
Yeah, so the main scope difference between that historical period and our historical period is that, violence was much more prevalent back then between disputing kind of like conflict between labor and worker interests. So it's like, yeah, I have to think about it because it's a very different game, right? Or originally, partly, all the, when you go to kind of the history of labor union in Europe, mostly, they actually start running to Congress and they try to influence Congress as a way to protect themselves from very harsh and violent repression from the And so, but it's yeah, I really have to think about that. And thank you.
I can add something to that as well. So something that is pretty different from back then to what we have today is that the composition of the labor force has been changing, and has been changing in some places towards more skilled labor. And as our theory says that basically more skilled labor are going to have a higher trade-off from forming a union, despite there's been robots being introduced, because they're going to be more likely to be complements. So given the change in the composition of the labor force, you might not actually have those mechanisms that you used to observe, for instance, with the Luddites and things that happened in the early 20th century. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. We can always continue that discussion later, but for now, Arthur, the floor is yours for a paper on cutting special interest by the roots, evidence from the Brazilian Amazon, which is joint with Ricardo Derris. You can share your screen if you want.
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So thank you. So Vincent already introduced us, so I'm going to skip to the motivation here. So the whole idea of our paper, so we're going to study a little bit like the influence of special interest on deforestation in the Amazon. And the motivating idea is that you have like government policies that impact economic outcomes, both directly, but also indirectly by affecting the political equilibrium. So, and this is clear in the case of environmental destruction, in which especially in these regions in which resource-intensive sectors such as mining or agriculture are really important, you might have an equilibrium in which politicians, they are going to cater to the local voters' interests for resource extraction. And in this context, top-down environmental policies, they might change the electoral returns these politicians have to promote environmental degradation. And however, we don't see like this being taken into account in environmental policy recommendations, especially because like this partially because there's very little empirical evidence on it. So what we do in this paper, we're going to study how strict environmental policies have influenced the behavior of politicians of a strong special interest group operating in the Brazilian Amazon, which are the farmers. So this is a really well-organized group in Brazil. So with this organization up to the Congress, like they control about 30% of the Congress, they control ministries, a lot of cabinet positions. And this is a group consistently opposed to conservation policies, at least since the late 80s. And one advantage of the electoral data that we have is that we do observe candidate occupation. So we can proxy their presence on local elections. And when we do this, and I'm going to talk more about that later, like we find that 1/5 of the local candidates belong to this group. So what we are going to do is to explore policies that sync at real-time remote sensing monitoring of deforestation with a lot of enforcement on the ground, and to test how this policy affected the behavior of the politicians belonging to this group. And what we know about this policy, there are two important features here. One, because like you really extended the reach of the state in the Amazon, in the sense that it made it much easier to monitor what's the environmental crimes happening there, this increased a lot the cost of deforestation. And you have like some evidence on this. But also, and that's important aspect to our context here, it decreases because now the national government that's going to operate this policy, they don't need the local officials to help them to identify what deforestation is happening. So it's going to decrease the relevance of collaboration of local politicians for identifying deforestation. So to test how this policy affected the behavior of these farmer politicians, we started building a simple political agents model with multiple issues, much like in the spirit of the model of List Sturm, of how politicians choose environmental policies and how political competition affects this. And in this model, the politicians are going to decide on the provision of goods and to implement or not pro-deforestation policies. And what's going to be the key here, is that the voters are going to believe that these farmer politicians are much more likely to also support deforestation than the other politicians. And what that means in equilibrium, that means a farmer is going to serve as a signal to commitment to pro-deforestation interests. And as a consequence, we're going to draw like two predictions here. First, that farmers are going to cause more deforestation, and they're going to be reelected more. So the deforestation part can be coming from a preference mechanism. So these guys are more likely to post and support deforestation, but there's also incentive mechanisms that these guys gain more when they implement for deforestation policy. And that's reflected on the reelection rates, okay? But we also find that when the environmental policy hits, this equilibrium is weakened, reducing deforestation and reelection rates overall, but especially of the farmers. And what we're going to do empirically is to test both these predictions using closed elections RD, exploring both an election before and an election after the policy. Our main outcome is going to be deforestation, but we are going to look also to agricultural production, land conflict, electoral performance. And important point here to our empirical structure is that the policy was enacted really before 2 terms. So you had like one election, and then the policy hit, and then the term began. And that means that like we are going to compare like both elections, both like before and after the policy, they were held in a similar environment in terms of environmental enforcement. But then after the election, the policy hit, and then you observe what the politicians do in the term or with the next election. So it's like we are fixing the selection and just changing the incentives, and that's going to be important here. So just a preview of the results. So we find that before the environmental policy, electing a farmer increased the deforestation about 170 square kilometers. It's about 3% of the municipality area, and this is a big effect. So it's kind of like electing a farmer triples your deforestation rates. This is fully driven by deforestation outside protected areas, which is consistent to the fact that even before the environmental policy, like the governance of these protected areas, either indigenous land or conservation units, was really strong in Brazil. It's completely explained by conversion of forest into pasture land. And why this is important? Because pasture land in Brazil has really low productivity. So this is kind of inefficient deforestation in some sense. And this is tied to an increase in land conflict. And it seems that a mechanism here is that the farmers are directing like these matching grants to subsidize agriculture at the local level. And the farmers, they do have some electoral advantage. These results are weaker, but they do have. And after the policy, like these results completely disappear. Okay. So we contribute to 2 literatures here with this paper. Like the first, like we are connected to this literature on the political economy of deforestation. And here our contribution is to show that farmers matter as a political group. Also show that this top-down environmental policies, they can have indirect political effects. But also we contribute to this huge literature on politician identity, both in showing that like occupation as important, might be an important form of identity, but also finding conditions for which identity matters or not. So it's not always that identity matters in our context, okay? So roadmap, so I'm not going to talk about the model, so I outlined the model in the introduction. I'm going to talk about the context, the data and empirical framework, the results, and then I'll conclude. So we're talking here about local governments in Brazil. So these are the municipalities. They held elections every 4 years. They choose a mayor and a council. So these municipalities, like the mayor is responsible for the executive branch. So he's responsible for providing basic education, health, public transportation, public service, so on and so forth. And these municipalities, they are financed by local taxes, by these rule-based transfers, and by these matching grants for specific projects. And here, the important feature is that because in these small municipalities, the local tax base is really small, so a lot of the actual in terms of effort of these mayors, it's to bring these matching grants for specific projects to their municipalities. So this is an important dimension of effort of those mayors. And then we can tie these matching grants to different areas, so agriculture, environment, education, health, so on and so forth. These mayors, they are not directly responsible for deforestation, but they can indirectly influence it through other policies, for instance, subsidizing agriculture, and also by reporting or tolerating this illegal deforestation on their municipalities or not. And this is, of course, is going to be more important before the environmental policy was implemented. And these farming politicians, they are really important at the local level, especially in rural regions such as the Amazon, okay? So a little bit about the environmental policy that we are talking about. We are talking about this action plan for the prevention and control of illegal Amazon. So in Portuguese, the acronym would be PPCDAM. And this was a policy launched in March 2004, but actually hit in November 2004. And it's composed of like these three main features of this policy. The first, which was the one implemented in the late 2004, early 2005, this DETER satellite system, which is like emits this deforestation alerts that are then connected to policing efforts on the ground. So what that basically means is that you have this satellite that spots deforestation, emits an alert that goes to the environmental police. The environmental police then comes together with prosecutors, with the federal police, and goes there and grabs the equipment, arrests the people involved, and so on and so forth. And then in 2008, so it's the end of our period here, we're going to have two other policies. The first one, restricting credit for farmers with environmental liability, and the second one, blacklisting 36 municipalities that have high deforestation rates historically. And what that means is that like this is a big increase in enforcement of the environmental legislation. That's having two effects. First is like it's changing the returns from the policy, from the perspective of the farmers, of the loggers. So this is decreasing the effect, but also like it's decreasing the importance of local politicians for identifying deforestation. Okay, and here like these two features are going to be important in our theory, because like these two features are going to drive down the incentives that the politicians have for enacting pro-deforestation policies. So first, because the cost is increasing, but second, because the benefit is decreasing, because like people gain less from the foresting in this new context. Okay, so here we're going to use like data on elections, deforestation, land use, and land conflict. I think that the important part of the data here is that on the electoral data in Brazil, we observe characteristics of the universe of the candidates. So not only the elected politicians, but the universe of the candidates. We observe like their occupation, their instruction, their gender, their age. And that gives, this is important, it's going to be really important for identifying farmers in the data. And the other feature here is that we're going to explore two electoral terms. So 2001, 2004, 2005, 2008. So 2001, 2004 is a term that occurred really right before the policy hit, and 2005, 2008, right after the policy hit. And the feature that I mentioned here is that the policy actually hit after the elections for the mayors who government here in this period was held. So the elections were held in October and the policy hit in November, okay? So in some sense, our claim here is that we are comparing like the selection of the politicians was the same, but then they are governing under different incentives, okay? How we doing the data to identify these farmers? So we took all politicians that self-declared as landowners, farmers, and a whole bunch of occupations, and we call them as farmers, okay? And then we find that these politicians are about 1/5 of the candidates in the Amazon. We don't know their formal ties to these agricultural lobbies, but we do know for the politicians that eventually got elected to Congress, whether they join the Rural Caucus in Congress or not, and we find that they are much more likely to join the Rural Caucus. And the important feature in Brazil is that like a lot of politicians have incentives to join the Rural Caucus, even though like they are not really tied to agriculture. So a lot of non-agricultural politicians, they join, but the fact that the farmers join much more. And these politicians, in the data, they are disproportionately older, male, less educated, and more right-wing, okay? So how we're going to test the effects on environmental outcomes and on environmental and political outcomes, we are going to start comparing farmers and non-farmers both before and after the policy. So this is kind of similar to a difference in difference specification. It's not a difference in difference in the sense that whether there's a farmer in office in that municipality in that period might be changing over time. So it's not that we're comparing the same municipality before and after the policy, like this is changing over time. So it's easier to see this as like it's a cross-sectional framework in which we are basically like in two periods comparing the effects of having a farmer and seeing whether these effects are changing over time, okay? And because there's a bunch of endogeneity issues here, we also, and that's our main specification, we run these closed elections RD both before and after the VPC done. So we're basically running a standard RD specification using the vote margin of the farmer as our running variable both before and after the policy. The issue when we do this is that restricts a lot our samples. So this is a map of the municipalities in the Amazon, and the green and black, light green, green and black here are the municipalities in our sample. So what means is that when we are running this RD, we need a farmer to be in the top 2 candidates for mail. And that restricts our sample. So our sample drops from more than 500 municipalities to about 100 municipalities in each term. And not only this, but also like we are not observing the same municipalities in the 2 periods. So we do all the regular tests of validity of our RDs, so bunching at the discontinuity, balance at the discontinuity, but we also do I try to understand whether the selection of the municipalities that are in our sample changes over time, because we're going to compare these RD coefficients, and we want to make sure that we are not comparing different local average treatment effects. And what we find is that there's selection into the sample, but the selection is not changing over time, okay? So I'm going to start here just showing like the patterns of like, so estimating this equation here, like this cross-sectional comparison.
Arthur, you have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, great. So before the policy hit, we find that across like these farmers, they were deforesting more. The municipalities governed by them were deforesting more. The CO2 emissions were higher, and they were more likely to be elected than re-elected. And then re-election here is not the re-election of the politician himself, but also the re-election of a politician of that group, okay? So it can be the politician or other ones. And here we find that they are re-elected more than the politicians, than the other politicians. And after the policy hit, like this difference, they either disappear for the case of deforestation, or they either fall a lot, okay? And when we test for the difference, like especially for the deforestation, the results are really robust. For the other outcomes, they are more, they are noisier, but we do seem to, like, these things seem to be going in the direction of our predictions from the theory, okay? Of course, like these results could be endogenous. So when we do the RD, like for deforestation, so the graphical evidence and everything else we do, it's really clear, like before the policy, deforestation was much higher, and actually like this difference at the discontinuity, it's higher than this mean effects here we are estimating after this difference completely disappears. And for emissions, we have the same pattern, noisy results. For re-election rates, actually like the results go to 0, so we have nothing. And this is what we find when we do this in the regression. So for deforestation, so these politicians were deforesting much more before the policy hit. Then this difference goes to 0. So actually the difference is statistically significant. For emissions, we have like similar pattern, but the results are noisier, and re-election rates, we have nothing, okay? The thing about the RD here is that the sample size are really small, okay? So because of this, so we run the most specifications we run using the optimal bandwidth by Canonical and Cataneo, but also like we vary this bandwidth a lot to test whether this is robust, and that like these results are really robust to bandwidth, which we do a bunch of measuring tests, so like excluding outliers, wind horizon, changing the deforestation measure, using other costs of deforestation, and actually there's nothing there. We do find like the patterns of deforestation. This deforestation is also, we run this RD at the pixel level, okay, for deforestation, and we find similar results. Running at the pixel level increases a lot the number of observations, but of course the actually the experiment is occurring at the municipality level, so like it's not that we increase a lot our sample. When we do like we test for the patterns of deforestation, we have this what I mentioned in the beginning, that deforestation is coming from deforestation in private lands, so outside protected areas that are public lands. It's coming from conversion of forest into pasture land, which is kind of a bad outcome. We find nothing in terms of agricultural production, so no effect on agricultural production. But we do find that a possible mechanism is that the males they are bringing more matching grants to finance agricultural activity. So this is basically like making getting some money for a state or federal government to purchase a tractor that local farmers can use, and that could be used to deforest. Okay. Another important result that we do see that land conflict, like because there's more deforestation happening, we also see more land conflict happening before the environmental policy hit in these municipalities governed by the farmers, and this completely like this difference completely disappears after. And this is like really connected. There's a literature, some papers showing that illegal activities in the Amazon are associated to more land conflict. So another bad consequence of having these farmers in office is that there's more land conflict. So just to conclude, so this is a paper, like our main message here is that like local governments matter for deforestation. And in particular here, we find that these politicians connected to agriculture, they deforest more, okay? But we also find that this is not something that happens always. It really depends on the institutional context. So like these effects really disappear with the implementation of stricter environmental policies, suggesting that these policies have political spillover. And actually like this has like two important implications, because it not only reveals the importance of local politics for the dynamics of deforestation in the Amazon, but also suggests that the reverse of conservation policy that we are observing right now in Brazil might have spillovers through changes in incentives for local politicians. And there's actually like a lot of anecdotes on this that I can talk about later. But okay, thanks. Thanks.
Thanks, Arthur. Could I just ask a question about the last table you showed, the effects on settlements? So yep. you have yes. So I would have expected perhaps a positive effect before the policy on settlements. Thanks to deforestation, this attracts settlers, and then this effect disappearing. So you have something a bit different. Yeah. How do you interpret these results?
Yeah, this is actually a good question. I don't have like a strong sense why this is not positive before and goes to zero after. One thing that I know about this data is that like actual conflicts, coding of actual conflicts and murder, because these are more extreme events, so the measure is better than for settlements. So this is noisier. So maybe we are not capturing all settlements that are occurring, and so that is what's happening. But that's another explanation here might be that like settlements are kind of like, if you believe that deforestation is led by large farmers and settlements are led by small farmers, then what might be happening is that like these mayors are kind of controlling settlements before, and then when they stop controlling settlements by favoring large farmers, so the settlements fall in their regions. But I don't like, this is something we have to think a little bit more. Yeah, that's a good comment.
Interesting, great. Thanks for the great presentation. So I'm going to introduce myself. I'm the last paper in this session. All right, so let me share my screen. Okay, can you all see my paper? Yes, all right. So I have until 9. Okay, so that's a paper with Caroline, who is also in the panel. She presented the first paper today. It's a paper in which we ask how campaigns shape vote choice, and we address this question using multi-country evidence from 62 elections and 56 televised debates. So the reason why we got interested in this question is an old recognition, which sees that if you want a healthy democracy, you better have informed voters, voters who don't vote randomly, but try and identify the politician that best represent their preferences or that has the highest valence. And there are two long-standing views in political science. One is that electoral campaigns are a crucial period from the perspective of bringing informations to voters, because that's really the period in which voters accumulate all the information that they will use to decide which candidate they want to vote for. And then there's an alternative view, also very long-standing, at least dating back to Paul Lazarsfeld, that campaigns actually have very minimal effects. Perhaps there's some information that is provided, but this information does not really impact which candidate people vote for. In fact, most voters decide to vote for the candidate that corresponds to their pre-existing group identity or party attachment. So there are people who are Republican voters and have been Republican voters for their entire life, and at the end of the day, they will vote for the Republican candidate. So the campaign doesn't really matter, doesn't really change anything to that. Even if you think that campaigns matter, there are still multiple ways in which campaign information might matter. First, it might change voters' beliefs on the qualities of candidates and on their policy positions. Second, it can clarify the identity of the frontrunners if you have an election with multiple candidates and a first past the post rule. Third, it can change policy preferences of voters. So I might start being anti-immigration at the beginning of the campaign and then be convinced and be in favor of immigration at the end and therefore vote for a new candidate. Or finally, fourth, the campaign can change the salience of different issues. So even if beliefs and preferences are not affected, it's possible that at the beginning of the campaign, I was going to vote for whichever candidate was closest to me on issues related to unemployment and the economy. And then the entire campaign is about immigration. And so at the end, I decide to vote for whichever candidate is closest to me on that question that has become more salient. The third background motivation is the idea that the information that might affect people's vote choice can be of two kinds. One is that perhaps some events are particularly important, like TV debates. TV debates might be particularly important because they reveal a lot of information at once. You see the two candidates unprompted, an exercise that they cannot entirely control. There are large audiences. There's a direct effect of watching the debate and potentially a multiplying effect due to subsequent discussions and media commentaries about the debate. Given that we're going to use a cross-country setting, one advantage of the debate is that they have been used in a growing number of countries after the first debate in the US in 1960. Now, there's another view, which is instead that debates don't matter so much, that this type of events don't matter so much, and that instead, the way in which people form their vote choice is by accumulating information from discussions they have with neighbors, discussions with party members, etc. So the question that we ask is how much and why campaigns matter. And there are three sub-questions. First, to what extent do voters change their vote choice during the electoral season? Second, through which mechanism? Is it because their preferences change, their beliefs change, or because some issues become more salient? So through which of these mechanisms does information affect their vote choice? And third, what's the contribution of TV debates to this process? So we build on a very large literature, both in economics and political science. The first contribution that we make is to provide rigorous estimates about the impact of TV debates on electoral outcomes. And here we complement existing literature that has focused on the effect of other types of campaign communication or other types of sources of information, so interpersonal discussions, the media, etc. Now, there's very little systematic evidence so far about the effects of TV debates between candidates. Most existing studies that have taken place mostly in the US, also in a few other countries, have focused on one debate or a few debates only, so it's a bit hard to get both internal and external validity with the designs that you can use in these cases. And then there's recent experiments, great experiments, but that have taken place in low-income democracies, when instead we're going to focus on OECD countries and studying non-TV debates. So debates that are shown on smartphones or in public gatherings or broadcasted on the radio, which you might expect to produce different effects than televised debates that are watched by the full population. The second contribution is that we estimate the overall influence of all sources of information and types of campaign contact on vote choice. And here our contribution is really, instead of just focusing on one source of information and beyond just measuring the impact of TV debates, to get a proxy for the effect of all information. And our proxy is, let's see what fraction of people change their mind. This will give us an indication of how important all the information received during the campaign is. And finally, we assess the contribution of different mechanisms, changes in beliefs, policy preferences, and issue salience to the formation of vote choice. So let me say a bit more about the data, and then I'll turn to our three sets of results. First, on the formation of vote choices, second, on changes in beliefs, preferences, and issue salience, and third, on the impact of TV debates. So our data comes from nationally representative surveys that were conducted around 62 elections in 10 OECD countries since 1952. Overall, we have more than 250,000 observations. And what's common to all the surveys that we use is that each and every one of these surveys surveys a new set of voters each day before the election. So there is a sample surveyed 60 days before the election, then a sample surveyed 59 days, etc., etc. And then on top of that, everyone is surveyed both once before the election and once after the election. And therefore, we can compare their answers to two questions. The first one asked before the election is, which candidate do you intend to vote for? And the second asked after the election is, which candidate did you actually vote for? Using these two questions, we can measure people's consistency, and so we can know whether by the time in which they were surveyed before the election, they already knew who they would vote for after the election. In fact, for more than 200,000 observations, we have repeated observations, meaning that people who were surveyed before were also surveyed successfully after the election. These surveys are rolling cross-section, meaning that they draw randomly the samples that are surveyed each and every day, or surveys that don't use quite that method, but that are statistically close to it in the sense that we can check that the socio-demographic characteristics of respondents surveyed on different days, 60 days before, and 59 days, 58 days, etc., are very similar to each other. So that any difference in the response of these individuals can be attributed to the fact that we're closer to the election and not to the fact that the samples are different. A number of election types and voting rules are covered by these different surveys. So the first key variable is the one I mentioned. Is the one coming from comparing vote intention stated before the election with vote declaration stated after the election. And we call you consistent if A, you provide a vote intention before the election, and B, this vote intention corresponds to the vote choice that you're going to state in the post-electoral survey. On top of that, we can use the same method to look at the formation of policy preferences, again, using policy preference questions that are asked both before and after the election. Beliefs on candidates' quality and issue positions. We have 46 questions on preferences, 76 questions on beliefs, and questions asking voters which issue they find the most important in the campaign. These questions are asked both before and after the election in 12 of our surveys. Are there any questions so far? All good? All right.
Very quickly, Vincent, do you worry about cognitive dissonance if you're looking at answers before and after elections?
Yes, we worry about that. So I don't know if that's what you have in mind, but we worry about the possibility that people say the same thing after the election as they said before the election because they don't want to be found as someone who has changed their mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. So we worry about that, and we think that this could increase depending on the number of days that have elapsed between the first survey and the second survey. And there's a way for us to control for this by controlling for the number of days that have elapsed between the election and the date of the post-electoral survey.
Thanks.
So let me show you our results on the formation of vote choices. Using the outcome that I described before, so m equal to 1 if the respondents' pre-election vote intention and post-election vote declaration coincide, we regress that dummy on 60 dummies, indicating the 60 days separating the pre-election interview from the election. What's important is that on top of that, we control for fixed effects for the day of the week in which a pre-electoral survey took place, because you could imagine that a survey taking place on Friday is going to survey a slightly different population. The people willing to respond will be slightly different on that day than if you try to call them on a Monday. And we also control, as I mentioned, in response to Francisco's question, we also control for the number of days separating the post-electoral survey from the election. One of the reasons is to address the issue that could come from cognitive dissonance. And the second issue that we want to address is the possibility that as more time passes, people start forgetting how they voted in the election, or people become more likely to misreport. For instance, they become more likely or less likely to say that they voted for the winner. That's what we obtain. So here I'm plotting our results, namely the fraction of people who are consistent between their pre-election vote intention and their post-election vote declaration for each day separating the pre-electoral survey from the election. And as you see, 6 days before the election, about 72% of voters are consistent. So about 72% of voters say, I'm going to vote for candidate A. And then it turns out that after the election, they report, I actually voted for candidate A. And then this fraction increases slowly over time by 17 percentage points to reach 89% of consistent voters just the day before the election. At that time, there are still 11% of voters who either say, I don't know who I will vote for, or they announce voting for A and in the end, vote for B.
Vincent,
yes?
Can I ask one question? Is this heterogeneous across countries?
That's across countries, yes.
No.
You want to know how it varies across countries. I'm going to show that result. I'm going to show that result in 1 second. Yes. For now, let me just say that this increase in vote choice consistency comes both from an increase in the fraction of people who state a vote intention instead of saying, I don't know. That's a red line here. And an increase in the fraction of consistent people conditional on saying a vote intention. So they are really the two forces contributing to the effect. Now, and that's in response to Arthur's question, of course, since we have multiple countries, we can plot the daily increase in vote choice consistency in all these different countries. So the country for which we have the most surveys and the earliest surveys are the US. As you can see, we have a positive effect. So usually there is some daily increase in vote choice consistency during the campaign, but much less so than in basically all the other countries in the sample. And we think that's quite important because most of the literature on campaigns takes place in the US. And so this is a bit of a message to be cautious about trying to expand the lessons that can be learned from the US about other countries where it seems that campaigns matter in the end much more than they do in the US. Now, of course, the fact that people form their vote choice would be very interesting, but in the end, not very impactful. If, for instance, Arthur changes his mind and initially plans to vote for A and in the end vote for B, but Caroline does the opposite. Initially plans to vote for B and then ends up voting for A. So if there are these alternative trajectories, perhaps they compensate each other, and the vote shares, the aggregate vote shares themselves are fixed. Instead, what you see on this graph is that when we plot the distance between the predicted vote shares based on people's pre-election vote declaration and the actual vote shares based on their reported vote choice, we see that this distance decreases over time. So it's not like individual trajectories fully compensating each other. This formation of vote choice actually matters for the outcome of the election. So our interpretation of these results is that vote choice formation is mostly driven by information that is received during electoral season. We interpret the fact that people increase their vote choice consistency as reflecting the impact of information that they receive during the campaign. And we discuss alternative interpretations. One is that there are information processing costs, so you wait until the very end to form your vote choice. We think that this is a plausible complementary interpretation. And then we discuss an alternative interpretation, which is that people are affected by shocks that don't have any information content, but change who they plan to vote for. We don't think that this is what's going on, because if that were the case, we would not expect a convergence to the final vote shares. So let me show you now our results, trying to understand why exactly, through which mechanism exactly, information affects voters' vote choice. As you can see here, unlike the graph that I showed for formation of vote choice, we really have no effect in the increase in policy preference consistency. So policy preferences are very stable. They are stable in many our models, and interestingly, they are also stable in real life. People don't use the campaigns as a moment in which they are going to change their mind about immigration or about unemployment. We see an increase in the consistency of issue salience. So instead, we have some movement there. Perhaps people don't change what they think about immigration, but they might be more likely to consider immigration as an important topic at the end of the campaign than before. And we see a lot of action on beliefs about candidates, both beliefs about the quality of candidates and beliefs about issue positions of candidates. We see convergence, and so this seems to be a main driver of the formation of vote choice. Now, let me get to the last question, which is, all right, so information seems to affect people's vote choice, partly by increasing the salience of some issues, partly by changing beliefs on candidates' issue positions and quality. Now, what's exactly the type of information that matters? Is it, for instance, information that people receive when there are big events, such as debates between the candidates? So we use an event study design to address that question and measure the effects of 56 debates that took place in our sample in 31 elections and 7 countries. So it's a classic event study specification in which we plot the vote choice consistency of people, both before the debates. These are the 3 dummies for the 3 days before the debate, and after the debate. These are the 3 dummies for the 3 days after the debate. We omit the dummy corresponding to the day just before the debate. Importantly, again, we control for underlying time trends. So we control for the fact that vote choice consistency increases, as we just saw before, during the campaign, thanks to this 60 fixed effects here, so that we don't find that TV debates matter just because when we look at people surveyed after the debate, they are a bit more consistent due to the overall increase than those surveyed before. We have a relatively precise null result as our main effect of debates on vote choice consistency. As you can see here, in fact, we have a negative, if anything, but very small effect of debates on vote choice consistency. So people are a bit less consistent after the debate. We can reject any effect larger than 0.5 percentage points, so 3% of the overall increase in consistency at the 5% level. We get the same qualitative conclusion when we look at the effects of the debates on the distance to final vote shares. Again, a non-significant result, and we can reject relatively small effects. So to conclude, what we find in this paper is that campaigns matter. So we are on that camp. We don't think that campaigns are completely useless and that in the end people end up voting for whichever candidate is a candidate of the party that they have long affiliated with. No, we do find a 17 percentage points increase in the fraction of people who state a pre-election vote intention that is identical to their vote choice reported after the election. The effects are larger for younger and less educated voters. I didn't show this, but this is consistent with a model in which people who have less information to begin with are more affected by campaign. And we find that vote choice changes are driven by changed beliefs on candidates' issue positions and quality, more than changes in the beliefs on candidates' chances of victory. there's also some effect that comes from changes in issue salience. Now, this is not to say that voters are an uninformed public that is swayed by any information that they receive. Instead, we find that policy preferences are not affected by the campaign. And very salient events that attract a lot of media attention, that are very dramatic, in particular the TV debates that we focus in the paper, the TV debates between presidential or prime minister candidates, these events do not affect vote choices. So that suggests that the reason why vote choices change is rather due to the incorporation of a lot of information that is accumulated slowly by different voters. This can be information received from the media, information received from canvassers, information received from neighbors and friends and family members, but not information that affects everyone, the full population, in big chunks. And so I guess a recommendation would be for candidates and administrations regulating elections to focus more on these other forms of communication. Thank you. So now we have about 5 minutes to discuss. I know that there were questions in the chat for Caroline. There are also questions for Martin and Arthur, I'm sure. So the floor is open.
Okay, so maybe I could start by answering Arthur's question that was in the chat.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks, Arthur, for the question. So I think, yeah, it's a nice parallel that you're drawing between lobbying, which may also shift the information set that politicians have about about issues. I had not thought about that parallel at all. So thank you. But I guess, so if I understand your question correctly, so you're imagining that maybe these corporate donors, as lobbyists, they are giving to candidates because they're trying to shift policy making. They're trying to push forward a policy agenda that works best for them. So this would be more aligned with the quid pro quo mechanism that we assume, like we acknowledge it can be present, but we believe that in the context that we're studying is not the primary channel. The reason being that the effects that we see on the campaign discourse, it's really driven by more of these small corporate donors who are like more local donors who may be unlikely to be giving because they're trying to shift the entire views of the parliament, basically. But more what we interpret our results as being more like, local donors giving to the candidates that they like, so doing more expressive donations. And for the candidates receiving these expressive donations raises the salience of some issues more than others. So it could be that, so in that sense, I guess the corporate donations that we have in our setting at least would be more of a complement or just like a different ways of affecting politics, that money may affect politics.
Thank you.
Martin.
Yeah, I have two questions. So the first one is for you, Vincent. So do you have any way of exploring the result of information on turnout? In this idea that there are some uninformed voters that might just delegate the voting decision, right, being the pivotal voter for other voters. I couldn't tell if that could have fit your framework or if your framework could have said something about that. And then I also, let me say, I also have a comment for Arthur, like a quick question, is this deforestation illicit, right? This is illegal, right? What they're doing. Yeah, so I was wondering whether you can also talk to there's a very wide, like big literature on illicit markets and violence in illicit markets that and I think your paper would be very, very, very appealing to that literature because most of the papers that you find on violence in illicit markets are mostly, illicit drug markets and illicit mining. And so I think, having something, observing what you have through the lens of, this is another, illicit market and there's violence on it and there's politics. I think that it could be very, very appealing.
Can I quickly jump in and complement Martin's questions to you, Vincent and Caroline? Very quickly, I was thinking the effect would be heterogeneous in looking at likely voters and unlikely voters. People that have already decided to go to vote for sure, but maybe are undecided of who to vote for. that could have, you know, debates can have a different effect than those who are unlikely to go to vote and maybe increase turnout, or yeah. So I wonder if there's an heterogeneous component there.
Yes. So the paper is really focused on vote choice, and the reason for this is that the surveys do ask people about their intention to vote or not, but typically we don't trust people's response to these questions so much, because we know that there's a tendency to largely over-report one's intention to vote, given that there's a civic norm around that. And so still we measure the effects on that outcome in the paper. So we find that there's an increase in the fraction of people who intend to vote during the campaign, a bit similar to the increase in the fraction of people who are consistent. And then one thing that we do as well is to measure the effects of TV debates on that outcome. And there we don't find any increase in people's intention to go and vote after TV debates. So it doesn't seem that this is one of the levers through which TV debate affect elections. Arthur, did you want to say a word?
Oh, no, just to thank Martin for the comment. I think this is a good comment. I think we could connect more with this literature. Yeah, thanks.
And Vincent, I think Francisco has had a follow-up question in the chat for us about whether we can control for scandals during the campaign.
Yes, that's a great suggestion. We haven't collected systematically data on scandals, but we could try and do that. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Are there any other questions? I think we've reached the end of our time, and I see that Andres is monitoring this as well, but is there perhaps one very last question?
So I have a very, very quick question for Arthur about your RD. I was wondering, I know you already have an extremely small sample size. I was wondering if you are already restricting to open seat elections only, or are you looking at all elections?
All elections.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was it.
All right. So thanks a lot, everyone, for participating. Thanks for the comments also by people in the audience. And good luck to all the